Hi, Elle. Welcome to my Action Research Proposal presentation. Good morning. The title of my presentation is, Do I Have to Do This in Spanish? Bienvenidos to Spanish Motivation Club. Como se dice? Language Teaching Tasks by me, Olivia Tison, through Southern Oregon University. So let's dive into my context. I teach at a school called Park Spanish Immersion School located in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, which is a suburb of Minneapolis. I have 10 students with individual education programs, which stands for IEP, which means that they receive special education minutes throughout the day. 7 of my students are white, 3 of my students are students of color. I have 1 heritage Spanish speaker and the other are native English speakers. 6 of them are boys and 4 are girls. In addition to that, they're in first grade to fifth grade. They will be in the 2021 to 2022 school year. And these students spend 60% of their school day in Spanish, whereas the rest of their peers spend 70% of the school day in Spanish. This is important to note because it does influence my intervention and my study. The reason why that they are not in the Spanish setting for as much as their peers is because of their IEP and because they're receiving services in math, reading, and behavior in English while the rest of their peers are still in the Spanish classroom. So here's the problem. I have had, as a special education teacher in the Spanish immersion schools, have had a lot of teachers come up to me and say things like, these students refuse to speak Spanish, or these students won't try speaking Spanish. I've also had kids repeatedly ask me if they're in the resource room, which is the special education room. They've repeatedly asked me, do I have to do this in Spanish? And this is compounded with the fact that a lot of my students have anxiety, ADHD, and or depression that just leads to more time spent outside of the general immersion classroom and can sometimes seem that they have more aversion towards the L2 since they are in an English setting a little bit more of their day. So I've seen this result in the problem of several students with IEPs actually leaving Spanish immersion for English schools, which has made me wonder, are we doing everything that we can to keep students in the least restrictive environment, which in this case would be the Spanish immersion school? A question I ask myself is, can we increase the students' confidence and motivation towards the L2 so that they could actually stay in a Spanish immersion setting? So my research questions are this. Number 1, what impact does a Spanish club that includes explicit teaching of communication strategies and language teaching tasks have on elementary students with IEPs' willingness to communicate in the immersion classroom? My second question is, what impact does a Spanish club with explicit teaching of communication strategies and language teaching tasks have on elementary students with IEP's motivations towards the L2? There are 4 main concepts that I considered while doing my proposal. The first is in blue, and it's the importance and personal influences on willingness to communicate. The second is the situational influences on willingness to communicate, which you will see abbreviated as WTC. The third is in green, and it's the motivation through tasks. And the fourth is communication strategies. And all of these factors influence a student's L2 use. I want to touch here quick on the motivation through tasks, which is something that I discovered through Professor Julio Torres's class last year during the Southern Oregon University Spanish Language Institute session, and it really influenced my study and got me thinking about how else I could help increase my students' motivation in Spanish. Let's do some quick definitions. So willingness to communicate, as defined by Cow and Phillip, is being ready to use the L2 in a spoken conversation. Communication strategies here, as defined by Dornier, are techniques a speaker uses to communicate when presented with difficulties. I'll be focusing on 3. Number 1 is confirmation and clarifying, basically teaching como se dice and qué significa blank. The second is resourcing, when a student can actually use an assignment to reference a word that they are trying to communicate. And the third is circumlocution, which means using words that they already know to actually describe a word instead of knowing that word. Third definition here is motivation, which is defined by Muir and Dornier as a reason for long-term behavior toward the L2. And finally, we have language teaching tasks defined by Muir and Dornier as well, where students create something that is meaningful to them in the L2. Let's get into the literature review. So these are literature review highlights the importance and personal influences on willingness to communicate. So we're going to see a lot of McIntyre here. In 1998, McIntyre stated that the purpose of L2 education is to create willingness to communicate. In 2003, he did a study focusing on age and gender, and in terms of his results on age willingness to communicate, he found that L2 willingness to communicate was significantly higher in higher grades as opposed to lower grades, which demonstrates for me that lower grades may have less willingness to communicate and therefore less L2 use. And here we have Diwali and et al. In 2018, who measured foreign language enjoyment and language classroom anxiety, and Diwali found a significant difference on the effect of anxiety on low intermediate learners than on high intermediate and advanced learners. So let's take it to situational influences on willingness to communicate. So Cal and Phillip in 2006 did a study that researched the role of whole class, small group, and dyadic interaction, which is just partner work. Their results showed that a student's willingness to communicate significantly increased in partner work and group work compared to a whole classroom context. This showed that students were more apt to speak when with people they considered friends as well. Secondly, we have Shen and Byfield in 2018, who recommended teachers, after doing their research, they recommended teachers to give more opportunities to communicate in small groups for students working on their L2, and to also create a classroom environment based on listening and patience. Moving right along here to my literature review for motivation through tasks. So Muir and Dornier here in 2013 developed the theory of directed motivational current. What they did was they expressed the role of cultivating motivation through authentic language teaching tasks. They suggested that students should have autonomy over tasks that help make these tasks authentic to them. Winnefield in 2012 stated that elementary Montessori immersion schools can incorporate language teaching tasks into their elementary school curriculum. And we have Poppy and Abdolazadeh, who in 2012 looked at the future L2 self versus the L2 self, which the future L2 self is visualizing yourself in the L2 in the future, and the L2 self is basically working towards an L2 because you feel like you have to. And their study affirmed the present research in the practice of developing tasks to enhance a student's motivation toward their future L2 self and not a student's L2 self. So the last part of this literature review is the communication strategies, which Dornier in 1995 showed that students had a positive attitude towards using the communication strategies, especially towards circumlocution. And Lamb in 2010 researched the effect of teaching communication strategies on both high proficiency and low proficiency English language learners. And Lamb found that communication strategies can be taught to lower proficiency learners, and it can be useful to them. Whereas before, they didn't know whether or not teaching communication strategies would be good for low proficiency learners. All right, so let's go to this timeline here. As you can see, there is a control period lasting from September to the beginning of October. After that is when teachers will receive their pre-observation data forms, where students will receive their pre-Likert survey, and where parents will receive a pre-email interview with them. After that, we have the intervention, which I'll talk more about in just a second. And that'll go from the beginning of October until mid-November, so 6 weeks. After that, there'll be a post-observation data intake from teachers, post-Likert survey for students, and post-email interview with parents. Throughout the control period and the intervention period, teachers will be submitting a different kind of data to me, and also I will be keeping field notes. So let's dive in a little bit to the control period versus intervention. So in the control period, students will be prompted to speak in Spanish, just like any other student in the Spanish immersion school. They'll not be explicitly taught communication strategies, and they won't be involved in language teaching tasks. They'll have access to resource room rewards as always, and these are just rewards that correspond with their behavior intervention plans through their individual education program, so that students already have access to that before the intervention and during the intervention. So during the intervention, let's talk about that. Students will receive language teaching tasks and communication strategies. Basically, what's going to happen is each of the 10 students will be able to pick a friend to join our club. And the friends' data will not be a part of this study because it is not what my research question is measuring. But my students and their friend and myself will meet once per week for 30 minutes. And if we're in school, this will be during the lunch period. And if we're not, this will be at a virtual time that we collaborate on. So I'll have 10 groups of students with 2 students in each group. And the students will have access to rewards during this conversation group, in addition to their normal resource room rewards. Here's the intervention explored. So, like I said, we'll be doing a task during this time, and students will be given a choice and be given autonomy to choose from 3 tasks. So they can choose a task about dogs, that I'll show you in a second, a task about helping out a favorite YouTuber, and a task about taking a trip somewhere with their family. During this 6 weeks, the first part is going to be to investigate this task, to develop the task, and I'll throw them at them a problem, and then they'll have to redevelop it and their task, and then they will present in the way that they choose. As for communication strategies, I will be teaching clarification and confirmation in the first week, resourcing in the second, and circumlocution in the third. The 4th through 6th weeks, I will be reviewing all of these strategies with them. And for rewards, they're for those who give consent and those who do not. And there's 3 levels. It'll basically be a marble jar, and every time students are using Spanish with prompts even, or using communication strategies, I'll be putting in marbles, and they can earn different levels, choose to save rewards, etc. So here's an example of the intervention. This one is the one about the dogs, and students can choose to do this one if they want. Basically, it describes that they visited Guatemala with their family, and they noticed that there were a lot of stray dogs. They wrote a letter to the mayor. The mayor gave them $5,000 to help solve this problem. So during the course of the 6 weeks, they will develop what they're going to do with that money and make a budget. And at the beginning of each club, I will be teaching them the strategy. And in this case, I'd be teaching them confirmation and clarifying. Here's my data collection methods in terms of quantitative data methods. The tools are the pre and post observation data from teachers on Students L2, the pre and post Likert survey, the effect size population test to compare control period to the post intervention period. And here are the methods. So for the first 2, we have paired t-tests, and for the effect size, we have the unpaired t-test. And here's an example of the Likert survey. And here's an example of the observation data from teachers. And as far as qualitative methods, I will be doing pre and post emails, interviews with parents, and I'll be doing inductive coding to see patterns, as well as my own field notes, inductive coding to see patterns. Here's an example of a parent interview question. And as far as my conclusion, I hope that this will add to existing research on motivation and willingness to communicate in students with IEPs and immersion schools. I hope the task-based learning with communication strategies will create more willingness to communicate in students and add to existing research of IEPs and immersion schools. Quickly, here's my references and the appendix of the rewards. Thank you guys so much, and I look forward to your